So the point was made that it's a good time, because the cost of fertilizer relative to cost of cattle, it's a good time to catch up on your fertilizer. And I agree. Sometimes we look at things as expenses when maybe we ought to look at them as investments. But that's probably a topic for another day. So we know that you've heard maybe people say that if you give 1 million monkeys typewriters, they'd reproduce Shakespeare. And now thanks to the internet, we know that's not true. So we're in a world where very decreasing numbers of people have any contact with agriculture. They don't know it, but the problem is they often think they do. They've been given some strange ideas about it from a number of sources, and yes, the internet is one great source of a lot of strange information. But this is the nature of the public that we're dealing with, and if you read this, you find out that it was a survey recently done, Oklahoma State University Department of Agricultural Economics, and 80% of the people responding were in favor of a mandatory label on food containing DNA. These are the people that are also in favor of many other things that are likely to impact agriculture. How are we going to have a conversation with them? How are we going to have a conversation with a wider society about what we do and about the good work that we do? And we talked this morning about the truth about the role of animal products in the human diet. And so this afternoon we're going to talk about the truth about the environmental impact of what we do. I think we've got a great story to tell. I don't think we're very good at telling it. Here's another idea that's out there. It didn't come up today, but yesterday it came up when I asked, what do you think of when I say healthy diet? And somebody referred to, minimal processed food. So there's a long story here. I'll try to make it short. This is a delicatessen in Portland, Oregon, 2.5 hours away from where I live. It's called Edelweiss Delicatessen. It's a German store, as the name might apply. This is a wonderful place. I try to plan my trips accordingly. I try to keep a cooler in the car so that I can bring home stuff from this wonderful place. This is only a quarter of their meat counter. This is one of the best places I've ever been, and one of their wonders is this little beauty, Schweinebuch, stuffed bacon. You start with a side of bacon, and really, you don't need to go any further, but they do. Stuff it with their house-made bologna, which is finely chopped ham and mustard seed. Cook it, and then slice it. Yes, please. Yes, please. So I'm standing at the meat counter getting the prepared order that I'd been given, because you give me instructions and it'll work much better. So I have a shopping list, and we're getting that filled. And a lady is standing next to me, and she says, "Oh, it's all so good." And I said, "Yes, it is." And she said, "But it's so bad for you." You might be surprised to learn that I shifted right into the saturated fat is not harmful discussion. And she said, "Oh, no, I know that. It's so processed." Really? Really? You're saying that this is the equivalent of breakfast cereal or Wonder Bread or, I don't know, tofu in terms of being processed? I mean, all meat is processed, right? We don't just go out and start chewing on the steer. It does require some processing. And there is this big rage now about tip to tail or nose to tail eating, right? We're supposed to eat all the bits. What the heck is bologna for? I mean, I did grow up in Lower Bucks County. My mother's family is from Berks County. I know scrapple. Yeah. So I gave in first morning here and had a piece of scrapple, and it's not what I remember, and it's not worth going back for. But in any case, really? What else? So they say that you eat those bad hot dogs. Well, they talk about the bun. They don't talk about the condiments. They don't talk about the French fries fried in vegetable oil you probably had with it. And they certainly don't talk about the large, liter-sized drink of carbonated sugar water. It's all about the hot dog. Again, this is the gift of epidemiological food surveys. So I'm here to talk about how red meat is green. Unfortunately, green is a subject that's been conflated with a lot of other things, sustainability being the primary one, but then it gets conflated with other topics. I don't want to really go into all the naming of them, but you can easily build a list. This is why it's important, though, because this was a slide that I got from Dr. Slavin at her AFGC talk. Second point, since nutrition research does not support that vegetarian diets are healthier than animal-based diets, there is a movement to, quote, sustainability as the reason to support plant-based diets. I have learned the term this week, sustainababble. Again, we're not talking about science here. We're talking about belief systems. We're talking about stories. We're not talking about facts. And so it's important for us to learn how to defend ourselves, frankly. Because essentially they're saying we can't prove what we're saying is right from a nutritional basis, but we're more than happy to reach for another explanation. Justification. And what I've come to realize is it's not about science, it's not about facts, it's a whack-a-mole game. They're going to throw up some objection, we're going to deal with it, and then it's going to pop up somewhere else. Because that's just a means to an end. Ultimately, at the root of much of this is the belief that we should not eat animals. Ultimately, at its core is some belief that you should not be owning animals. Conventional wisdom. You know, the stuff that everybody knows. Ideas or explanations that are generally accepted as true by the public or by experts in a field. But such ideas or explanations, though widely held, are not examined. We don't think about this stuff. Unqualified societal discourse then preserves the status quo. Right? We all know it, somebody we like says it, so that reinforces it in our mind, and then it just keeps going and going and going. And I hope we started the process this morning of re-examining some of these popular beliefs. And we're going to continue doing that here with this afternoon. And this is my journey. I've been on this for a while. And I kind of feel like I'm in one of these dolls and I don't know which one. Because I've learned that when you break out of the box that you're in, you discover that you're in another box. That's okay, unless you're like the people that leap from box to box. Because when they exchange boxes, they don't bring the knowledge that they acquired before. They leave it all behind, so there's no advance. They just get stuck in another paradigm. And again, we've got to deal with sacred cows, theirs and ours, if we're going to stand up and try to talk with any kind of integrity about the story that I think we have every right to tell, because I think it's fully justified. Again, we need to understand that in many cases we're dealing with people who have no functional understanding of ecology. They don't understand how nature works, and they have this adolescent idea that there is such a thing as life that does not involve death. They are not adults. They're stuck somewhere in the development cycle. The idea that all of nature is a conjugation of the verb to eat is one that I like. And to tie into Johnny's talk, ultimately the soil eats us all. Soil wins. The theories, no matter how pertinent, cannot eradicate the existence of facts. A lot of people have a lot of great ideas of how about the world would be so much better if, it only went along their way. Unfortunately, that doesn't work out that way. And this idea of sustainability is one that's been with us for a little while. It became a source of funding a couple decades ago. I'm old enough to remember when that happened. About the same time that organic labeling came in. Not coincidentally, it involved the same people. I remember going to those people and trying to make the case that grass-based livestock production needed to be addressed in sustainable agriculture programs. And I was told by these people that animals had no place in sustainable agriculture because it was synonymous with vegetarianism. Now, that may have changed, but I think we need to carefully tease the roots apart because there's that origin. And we need to make sure which plant we're talking about. So along the line, I then came across this definition of sustainability, which for a while I liked until I made the mistake of thinking about it. Meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. That sounds good. That comes from a UN committee. You'll see this in many, many places. Then I started thinking about it, and I started getting introduced to people who thought more about it for longer than I had. And they pointed out, we don't have a real good ability to predict the future. Anybody remember Paul Ehrlich? Population bomb? He was wrong when he published the dang book. He said some incredibly racist things in there that he was applauded for because it really resonated with the attitude of the time. There's a lot of people that think that human beings are the problem on Earth. They describe us as a virus. They think it would be a good idea for about a third of the population to die. I notice that they don't volunteer. And the practical result of their great ideas is they always impact hardest on the poor, the politically outcast, and primarily people in countries other than Western countries. There are words to describe those kinds of attitudes, but when you're enlightened, then see, you can avoid that kind of accusation. But the truth is the truth. Oregon State University gave Paul Ehrlich an honorary doctorate, and it bugs the heck out of me. Because he continues to be wrong. And we still go to him and say, what do you think? He's sort of the weatherman of academia. Wrong day after day, and people still go, what do you think is going to be tomorrow? I've always liked the heavy horses. There's something about them that's always attracted me. Their majesty, their power, their beauty, in many cases, this idea that something so big is willing to submit to care and direction. There's something about that. But I have taken a 3/4 by 1/4 piece of bar stock and turned a horseshoe. I have punched the nail holes in the crease. I have arc welded toe grabs and turned block heels. I've nailed those puppies onto the, pulled a clip, hot fit, nailed them on. It's a real good way to get hurt. Glad I don't have to make my living that way. There's a certain romance here that's unwarranted. When these were the major means of transportation, how much of our land surface was dedicated to growing fuel? Approaching about a fifth. If you go to the web, you can find this little publication called From Horsepower to Horsepower. And what it describes is an interesting situation. In about 1890s, they're describing the great horse manure crisis of 1898. The title alone got me. When horses were the major means of locomotion in our cities were very unpleasant places. There was lots of horse manure that had to be dealt with. There was urine, there were dead animals, there was animal abuse, there were accidents from runaway horses. It was a bad place. In the summertime, the manure would pulverize, become a dust cloud, settle all over everything, come in your windows, onto your dinner. And their experts of the day could easily predict that in 30 years the horse manure would reach to a third-story window in Manhattan. So they decided that they needed to assemble a group of urban planners, come up with a solution. And they brought these people from all over the world to this conference, which at a time didn't mean hopping on the red eye. Significant investment in travel. They were booking 10 days to come up with a solution for this problem. They met. After 3 days, they left. They said it's hopeless because they couldn't imagine internal combustion engines. Part of our problem is we have no ability to predict accurately at all, but we have a limited ability to envision technology. And the weird reality is that the introduction of the internal combustion engine produced a cleaner environment. It improved the environment. And today we live in a better environment than we ever have before. But most people don't know that. How do we get that message out? Here's an example of technology that's coming that just excites the heck out of me. This is a dairy in Southern California. 1,100 cows. That's milking her head, and it's closed. So 1,600 head probably in the whole place. They're in big regulatory problems. You think you've got regulation problems, go to Southern California. It's amazing. They basically don't want you farming there anymore. What these people are doing is they're applying technology to their entire waste stream from the dairy. So what they're doing with this equipment is they are separating potable water from their manure stream. How does that shift the conversation about water consumption in livestock production? They then go ahead and take that semi-dry material and they put it through an anaerobic combustion process that produces a char product that they put on the soil as a carbon enrichment. It produces a higher, an ammoniated water as part of the process that they can use for fertigation. It produces methane, which they can then make zero sulfur diesel fuel out of and paraffin. 3 cow days worth of manure produces about a half a gallon of zero sulfur diesel, the cleanest diesel available, and about half a gallon of paraffin. When I was there the end of August, they said the paraffin was worth more than the diesel. Undoubtedly, it's the case now. How might that shift the conversation about energy use? But see, we've already made investments from a policy basis on which technology to apply to the manure problem because someone's decided that it needs to be methane digesters as the solution. And the problem with methane digesters is they never look at what you do with the digestate when you're done. So it's very hard for these people to find the funding and the backing to get this launched. But it's all old technology. If you remember what the Germans did to produce fuel in World War II, the gasification of coal, which, by the way, should be part of any rational energy policy this country has, it's the same technology. They're just applying it in a new way. There are some forms of renewable energy we just don't want to do. Human beings are renewable energy. The availability of cheap, reliable petrochemical energy freed us from some of the work that we don't want to do. And we don't want to be in a position of having others do. The availability of cheap, reliable energy is what enables prosperity. You do not get prosperity without it. And again, how do we get that message out when we've got so many other competing messages coming back to us? Well, the least that we can do is start talking about it. So I talk about grass-based health. Many of these things you've already heard about. The fact that the soil, plant, animal, and now human, it's all an interrelated web. And we need to start talking about this from a fact-based point of view, and I think we have an excellent story to talk about. I am a little concerned about some of the overselling that I hear from the food industry and from members of the ruminant agriculture industry. I'm not at all sure what this product is, ling, cod, wild caught, grass-fed. And I'm absolutely certain I don't understand a grass-fed pear. They're not talking cow-calf. Again, there's this romance about agriculture, and I'm all for people who want to go back to the land. I'm all for people that want to have a few acres and want to grow some of their own food. I envy them to a certain extent, but we should not confuse them with commercial agriculture. There is indeed a difference between farming with money and farming for money. And the people who farm with money make it hard sometimes for the people who are trying to farm for money. It's fine, I'm all for it, but don't start talking about like we can have an agricultural policy based on hobby farming. Really? No, it's not going to happen. But I do think that food is the bridge issue that can bring the agricultural and non-agricultural public together. Everybody eats. Many people are concerned about where their food comes from, especially with animals, how they were cared for. We've got a great story to tell them, but we've got no relationship to do that. And I'm suggesting we need to find ways to bridge the chasm that exists between the rural and the non-rural population. So true sustainability has to have a societal component, it has to have an economic component, and it has to have an ecological component. Notice I didn't use the word environmental. I tried to keep it on a science base. If you only are going to focus on one of those, it's not a meaningful conversation, and we won't make any advancements. You know, if you're not in agriculture to make money, you know, there's no sustainability without profit. Period. And if you're not in agriculture or you're not farming to make money, I would suggest that there are easier ways to not make money. They're going to involve a lot less stress, a lot less hazard to you physically, and you might enjoy not making money better. I don't know. So without a certain degree of prosperity, no society can afford conservation. If human beings can't get the animal products they need, they'll get the animal products they need. Wildlife gets decimated. We can see this everywhere we look in the world if we care to look for it with glasses that aren't tinted. You want to talk about local food, though, let's look at where the beef cattle are in the United States. The subject came up earlier about, you know, how are we going to get this affected? If we just start looking at all of the congressional districts in which there are cattle and start pounding on those people, there's going to be a bunch of people. And Virginia, I had to admit, I was surprised to see the relative contribution of Virginia cattle industry to the cattle numbers compared to Kentucky, because Kentucky's always blowing its own horn about how big a livestock state it is. But cattle have been part of the Virginia story for a very, very long time. This is a depiction of Jamestown Colony, 1607. And yes, at that time we had multifunction animals. We were doing draft, we were doing milk and meat from the same animals. Well, maybe not from the same animals, because oxen generally don't produce a lot of milk, do they? But you could try to use cows as draft. But the same breed is what I meant to say. And it's a huge source of income. I think the figure I saw recently was nationwide, it's $44 billion of farm gate value. I may be off on that. I have heard people say that the production of new wealth via turning grass into beef is the single largest source of new wealth generation in the United States. Now, maybe that's true, maybe it's not, but it is an important source of new wealth into an economy that badly needs it. How many people here have heard of Cahokia? Okay, you can see how close it is to St. Louis. There's the arch in the background. I'm standing on the top of this earthen mound. It's in western Illinois, just across the river. It's the largest existent earthen structure from prehistoric times in north of the Rio Grande. It is approximately 100 feet to the top, and it was about 14 acres at the base. And foolish people tried to describe that as a natural occurrence, a natural formation for a long time, until they finally understood it was the remnant of a former civilization in the Mississippi Valley. They call them the Mississippians. You can find evidence of these mounds throughout the Mississippi Valley. And in the 1200s, this settlement was larger than Paris or London. And it was surrounded by acres and acres and acres of corn. So corn's been in the Midwest for a very long time. And corn was in New England prior to the Pilgrims arriving. And oh, by the way, when the Pilgrims arrived, there was that guy Squanto who showed up. And he helped them. Where did he learn to speak English? Well, he had been seized by some Portuguese who had arrived earlier, brought some disease, took some people. By the time Squanto made his way back there, he brought back some ideas about how to produce corn and how to grow crops from the Netherlands. That fish head in the corn mound thing, that was Netherlands, that wasn't New England. So there's this whole scholarship about what North America, Central America, and South America looked like prior to Columbus. There are people who say that there were more people in Amazonia then than there are today. And if you think about the plains of North America and what pristine America looked like prior to settlement, you may think of this little herbivore. And the massive herds of those. Only one problem. There are people who now say that the massive herds were a pathological symptom of a disrupted ecology. The human managers had been removed by disease prior to the arrival of the big wave of European settlers. And with the loss of those managers, the numbers exploded. And these ecologists say that those massive numbers of bison did not exist at the time of Columbus and could not have been maintained much longer. They would have outstripped the resource. How might that shift the conversation if we start having that kind of knowledge out there? And think about it. You've got Cahokia that's surrounded by acres and acres of corn. Do you want these little units visiting on a regular basis? No, you'd like them 3 days away so you can reach out and bring in some, but you probably don't want them too close. And so there's evidence about how they selectively killed females, and there's all kinds of evidence that we barely know. Want to be real clear on this because I've been accused of saying something that I didn't mean to say, which may not mean I didn't say it. Maybe it didn't come out right. There is evidence of climate change, but that's what climate does. There's no such thing as a static climate. Hasn't been since the earth formed. If you look at the evidence, however, you get a different story than the one we frequently are told. So here's some data. The red line represents the model forecasts, and it's the average of well over 60 of these climate models. Okay? The green line represents surface temperature records. These are actual measurements. So the red is a model, the green is a measurement. And then the blue line represents the satellite measurements. So the satellite measurements of global temperature are the best measurement that we have of total global temperature, because our coverage of the surface is very poor. And the temperature records from those surface stations is very problematic, and we could talk about that if you'd like. The point here to note, however, is there's significant divergence between what's been predicted, what's been measured, and what's been most accurately measured. Once again, we're getting a different story than the data tells. Oh, did we hear something like that earlier today? Follow the money. Okay? But this is going to be the club that they use against you because they haven't been able to prove that whole saturated fat thing or the animal protein thing. So we've got to spend a little time with it. This is quotes from Van Soest's book. Anybody that remembers that from Ruminant Nutrition. Cellulose is the most abundant carbohydrate in the biosphere. Recycling depends on the activity of microbes both in ruminants and free living, and as we just heard, most of those are going to be in the soil. Without their activity, if photosynthesis continued unabated, the world would stagnate in about 20 years from lack of CO2. CO2 is not a pollutant. CO2 is a vital nutrient. It's a fertilizer. plant growth is being retarded due to a lack of CO2. We'll show that. Oh, but by the way, this word here, recycling, what does that mean? It means emissions. It's a different word for emission. It's recycling of carbon dioxide from a fixed form in either of some carbohydrate back to CO2. Okay. I don't know why I felt it was necessary to tell that, but in any case, people will talk to you or want to know about, but what about the carbon emissions from your cattle? Short story. For the short version of that story is simply this. Everyone who ever talks about carbon emissions from cattle does not include or consider where the carbon comes from that's being emitted. And I swear to you this is true. They only look at the output. But let's think about it. Cows don't make carbon, right? So where is the carbon going to come from that the cow's going to emit? From the food that she eats. So let's assume that this is a cow on grass. So it's going to come from the grass. Where did the carbon come from that's in the grass that the cow's going to eat that she's going to emit? From the atmosphere. They don't take it up from the roots. So we're talking about a system that takes carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, fixes it via photosynthesis into a carbohydrate that the cow then ingests, converts that into high-quality protein and animal fat so that we can eat it, and then emits some of it. Okay, so of the food that she consumes, that isn't the whole plant, is it? No, we just saw there's this massive root body underneath. And we also know we shouldn't eat all that's grown, right? We can't take it down to the soil surface. So if we're going to eat a given amount of food, we're going to leave a certain amount of leaf litter, we're going to leave a certain amount of root material, a certain amount of it's going to stay in the cow, and then some's going to get emitted. They never consider this in the equation. So you can make some assumptions, as I've done. You can argue with the math, and that's fine. But the fact is that cattle are carbon negative. How might that shift the conversation? I don't know. CO2 is the most important nutrient for all life on Earth. Present levels of CO2 are somewhere around 400 parts per million by volume. It's a trace gas. It's not a pollutant. It's absolutely essential. Pre-industrial levels were figured to be about 250 parts per million by volume. Note the difference of 150 parts per million by volume. That's what we're worried about right now, okay? So, we already said it, but did you know prior to me saying it that there is a point at which plant growth stagnates due to lack of CO2? That point's about 150 parts per million by volume. Plant growth stops, photosynthesis stops, oxygen generation stops, game over, life over. Had we, instead of going up by 150 parts per million by volume, gone down by a similar amount, again, game over, lose your quarter. Isn't that interesting? How do we get this message across? I don't know, but at least we can start here understanding the value that you actually are contributing to society. And oh, by the way, they do look at these things, and someone's estimated that over 600 million years, the average has been about 2,000 parts per million by volume. And not coincidentally, that happens to represent the optimum level of CO2 for plant growth. C3 plant growth. You can keep increasing the amount of CO2 in the environment that a plant's in up to 2,000 parts per million, and you'll keep seeing an increase in plant growth. That's interesting. Here's some evidence again that just ought to make us question the idea. Again, I am not denying climate change. What I wish to at least begin questioning is CO2 the driver of climate change? Is it the control knob? A lot of people think so, but this sort of makes me feel a little uncomfortable about that narrative. You have this widely varying range of CO2 concentration over time. You have this kind of temperature range over time. By the way, those dips are called ice ages. They occurred during periods of many, many, many times more CO2 than is present today in the atmosphere. And oh, by the way, you are here. So from a practical point of view, what's more dangerous for human health and welfare, cold or heat? Yeah. Cold is bad. So the second big gas that people are going to talk to you about is methane. The things to remember about methane is, one, methane has a short half-life, or a short lifetime in the atmosphere. It gets oxidized into CO2. Atmospheric water vapor's absorption of infrared radiation overlaps partly with that of methane. The importance of that is you can't absorb the same radiation twice. Water vapor is by far the most significant greenhouse gas that we deal with. I'm very grateful that at this point I can tell you that the EPA is not thinking about regulating water vapor. Give them time. And then methane's infrared absorption is in a region of the spectra where the Earth normally emits very little radiation. So what we're surrounded with are a bunch of true statements, but you have to kind of tease them out. And the big one for you to know about this is whenever they talk about the absorption of methane being so many times, multiple times more than CO2, what they're talking to you about is the performance of methane as a pure gas in the laboratory, not as methane as component of a mixed atmosphere. And so that's how they give you that kind of information. They're not lying. So we know about forages, so we won't spend too much time with this. I will just point out that today we have available to us improved grasses, improved legumes, improved forbs, and we should be using them all, and we should be using them all together, and that's enough out of that. Would like to just spend a little time reinforcing the value of forage dry matter and ruminant animal production. Because when I got my ruminant nutrition or my animal nutrition, I was taught that there are things called roughages and there are things called concentrates. And the only problem with that is the roughages were hay. They weren't pasture dry matter. And if you look at something like this, which is perennial ryegrass, white clover, chicory, dry it down, look at it on a dry matter basis, you've got something that if you take 14 pounds of it, you can make a pound of carcass weight. And if you take 7 pounds of it, you can make a pound of milk fat. And when people talk to you about how all these resources are going into feeding animals that could be feeding people, they're not thinking about this because they don't know about this. Now, under ideal conditions like New Zealand for perennial ryegrass, you've got a genetic potential for what any plant can do, and some of the researchers have pegged that at about 25,000 pounds per acre. So you can just kind of figure out what you could possibly do by doing the numbers. The energy equivalent is similar to barley and other concentrates, and frequently with much better protein content. Our grasslands are a critical resource that, again, doesn't get considered in the conversation. There are some 10,000 species, only 100 to 150 of which have been sort of utilized. So there's lots of room to work. Anywhere between 26 and 40% of the Earth's surface is classified as grassland. It depends on whether you want to include Greenland or Antarctica. And since they haven't melted yet, let's leave them out and say it's 40%. Land is incapable of producing crops. Oh, by the way, why did they call it Greenland? Because it was green at one point. Ever heard of the Little Ice Age? A point where the Thames froze in recorded history? Interesting. Its land is basically incapable of producing crops. 70% of the world's cropland area is, in fact, grassland. Tremendously important resource. The ruminants, again, ruminants rule. This is a rarely seen draft goat being coerced by drinking this alcoholic beverage, which I think this guy has had way too much of. About 150 species of ruminants in the world, both domestic and wild. Most of that list has been managed by human beings to varying degrees. Again, North America was a thoroughly managed grassland prior to Columbus. It was managed with fire. It was managed to a degree that there were open corridors from Ohio through to the Atlantic coast where bison could come across. And animals like elk have been recorded sightings from Florida all the way up. All the continental U.S. except for Florida have a recording of elk sightings. It's just that as they've lost more and more habitat, they kind of retreat to the mountains. But they're not a mountain animal. Approximately a third of the global meat supply comes from ruminants. And again, these are animals that are not consuming human grain. Work, fiber, meat, milk, hides. When people talk about meat production from grain input, they don't consider all of the products of the animal. They only look at retail cuts. Okay, so that's another way to shift the conversation, that there's a lot of products from these animals that all come from whatever they're being fed. One World of Food and Agriculture study from the UN suggested that of all the feed that goes into feeding animals, only 10% of it on a worldwide basis ends up being human utilizable. Specialized anatomy, we talked about that this morning. And again, there are people who think that your beef cow is chained to a trough for its whole life and fed nothing but corn. And when they talk about how many pounds of corn it takes to produce a pound of beef, they're making assumptions about the whole life of the animal, and they never once consider the fact that you've got this animal eating nothing but grass or milk for the vast majority of its life. What a difference a link makes. If you take D-glucose units and you link them alpha-1,4, you get something called starch, which happens to be tubular in cross-section. We can digest that. We make amylase starch, enzyme. If you link those same D-glucose units beta-1,4, you get something called cellulose. It's a planar molecule. We don't make cellulose. We can't digest it. The slide earlier said that we're depending on microbes, either in ruminants or somewhere else, to break those bonds and liberate the glucose so that we can make use of it. So the products of forage agriculture, again, butter, meat, and cheese, and they belong in the human diet. Again, you know this. Many people don't know the life cycle details of a cow-calf operation or what happens to those calves once they're weaned. And many people don't understand all the various forms of cattle industry or operations that there are, from cow-calf all the way down to the finishing operations. And these are all ones that can be completely appropriate in one environment and not in another. And that's one reason why we have cattle spread so widely across the country, because they fit in various forms. So again, people don't know this. We need to tell them. Already in the U.S. today, we know that the livestock industry is already a forage-based industry. What we're looking at are figures for all livestock and poultry, and even then, when you look at all the feed that goes into supporting all of them, almost 2/3 is forage. And that's because of what's happening with the beef industry. To support the nation's beef herd, 83% of the feed for the beef herd is forage. Not many people know that. They don't realize this thing about when the cattle go on feed is when they generally get the grain. And even then, they don't realize that more than a quarter of their ration is going to be forage. And this is old data. I would warrant to say this could be significantly more toward the forage now as things have changed. We have tremendous potential. We have tremendous room to change this, but this represents reality, not the common perception. Why did that go backwards? Again, they don't understand how you go from live animal to wrapped steak in the meat case. And so they don't understand the efficiency that's taking place in taking this 1,300-pound animal and yielding 639 pounds of retail cuts. What happens to the rest? Where does that end up? What's its value? Is that ever credited in the conversations about what it takes to raise cattle? I don't think so. They also aren't aware of the efficiency and the changes that have taken place over time, that we've got 17% fewer cows if you look 1980 to 2009, and I'm sure that number has changed a bit since then. And yet we were producing 29% more retail cuts per cow in 2009 than we were in 1980. And if you really, really, really are talking about sustainability, you have to be talking about efficiency. And if you really, really, really are concerned seriously about environmental impact, then anything that reduces the number of animals necessary to produce the product represents a positive. But of course, a lot of the technology that's involved in doing this is a point of contention for some of these people, and so that's the whack-a-mole thing, right? We've answered your one question, and now you're going to pop up with something else. Yeah, we should label DNA. Again, they don't understand that grass doesn't grow evenly throughout the year. And we need to help them understand that. We need to understand what the animals' feed needs are through the year. We need to understand what we have to help them understand, or it's an opportunity to help them understand what we do to fill in the gaps so that we can feed less hay, so that we don't have to put the inputs in, that we have this more sustainable system of running ruminant animals on perennial forages to produce high-quality animal protein and animal fat. We need to be confident in saying that as a forage agriculture, we can demonstrate these well-documented benefits of biological nitrogen fixation, soil fertility improvements, organic matter improvements we just heard about, soil structure and texture improvements, water infiltration, water holding capacity. I threatened yesterday to just put soil health across this because it's following Johnny's presentation. But that's what we're talking about. And the funny thing for me now is that forages have always had trouble getting support for research and funding and extension and at universities and federal funds over the last couple decades at least, let me say that. But what's really exciting now is this whole area of cover crops, right? And I'm here as a forage agronomist saying, but aren't they all forage species? So the benefits that you're getting from your cover crops are all benefits that the forage species contribute. Here's the demonstration of the benefits. This is southern Illinois. It's January. It's a continuous corn, but it's no-till corn with cover crop. It's in the middle of a rainfall event. Keep your eye on that area where that little gully comes off the field. This is the close-up of that area. That little bit of vegetation, annual ryegrass, peas, and I think it was radish, actually makes enough difference so that the water coming off that field is cleaner than the water that's coming down the ditch. And don't worry, they're going to figure out how to regulate the water that's running down the ditch by your property. But in any case, any efforts to stop the silting, the sedimentation into water courses is not going to be solved by buffer strips. It's going to be solved by improving the infiltration on the fields upstream. And that's what this is all about. So here's another rainfall simulator. This came from North Carolina. I saw it at the Maryland Cattlemen's Show. You've got the four sods here of clean till, overgrazed, pasture, and what they called well-managed pasture and cover crops. So this would be a good point to emphasize that just because there's a fence around it, don't make it a pasture, right? So you have the water being sprayed down on top of it, and then you're collecting what runs off. And in the time it took to collect these 2 gallons of sediment-laden water from clean till or overgraze, and 1/3 of a gallon from the cover crop, there's nothing in the pasture. So well-managed pasture is better than cover crop. And yeah, you're sitting by the side of the bay regardless of where you are, right? This is a huge impact. It should be a huge interest. And again, ruminant agriculture offers a real viable means for protecting the environment, for improving surface water quality, for improving infiltration, nutrient management, all of those issues. A different level of inputs than other enterprises. Grass is the wonder crop. The thing that does the heavy lifting in all the cover crop mixtures, as far as I can tell, is the annual ryegrass. If you're going to go out and take soil samples, do take the right tool. And I think this is the right tool for the job. I love American ingenuity. So this is one sample that was taken from greater than 2.5 feet down into the soil profile. You can see this is a nasty, tight, gray, formerly waterlogged subsurface layer of clay. You can see, however, that we're starting to get some oxidation, which indicates that the drainage is improved, and we're starting to get a chemical change going on in that soil. And you can also see that new root of an annual ryegrass going down that far through a layer that had previously prevented corn roots from penetrating. And it's opening things up, and it's increasing the rooting area that can be exploited by corn. Here we've got soil types are defined in part. One of the definitions is that has to do with the depth of the organic matter layer. The definition for this soil has the organic matter layer being about that deep. And as a result of his cultural practices, now he's got organic matter extending that far down. And he's a completely commercial corn producer. Happens to be no-till, happens to be cover crop, but in no way is he organic. And he's making this improvement in his organic matter content in his soil at a time when many soils across the area are depleting an organic matter layer. We need to shift the narrative. Because the weird reality is that practically, from what we now know, you could grow a cover crop, chemically suppress it, no-till drill into it, and you would be doing more to improve your soil health than growing a green manure crop and tilling it in. And again, this is just an example of what happens over time. The previous year, there had been just, a few roots coming down into here, and then the corn crop that just preceded this, there was one root that came down, and now that fracture is completely filled with annual ryegrass roots. Well, annual ryegrass is a fine forage, and perennial grasses would give us a longer-term tool to do much of the same work. So one of the things couldn't really explain from this trip, but it was interesting. We have forage rape planted in alternating rows with annual ryegrass, and for some reason, something's going on here that I don't know that anybody knows, but at every stem of every rape plant that he pulled up, there was an earthworm around it. I have no idea what's going on there, why there would be an earthworm at every single rape plant he pulled up. He finally got tired and said, "You got to leave some for me." So it's like, maybe this one, maybe this one. We talked this morning extensively, but practically when we think about societal sustainability, please, please, please keep in mind the unsustainable burden of our diabetes epidemic. And I have a dream, if you would. I can envision a day when the consumption of the product in the background lessens the needs for the products in the foreground. When the conversation shifts to where diabetes care isn't about treating the symptoms, but addressing the underlying issue. That is a diet that's higher in animal products, ruminant animal products. And again, if we don't consider that in the sustainability discussion, we're really going to miss it, because this is what's coming at us. If you start looking at the increased healthcare costs over the next few years, if things continue the way they've been tracking, this is why we have a healthcare crisis. And if you've read any of the stories about how they're having to buy bigger furniture in the hospitals, it breaks your heart. So vitality and beauty are gifts from nature for those who live according to its laws. But again, back to that knowledge is power slogan. If you've been given misinformation, you have no hope of understanding the laws. But you work with them every single day. As Johnny said, there are no other industries where single operators have to manage so many resources so intensively. And that's a great story that can be communicated. How do we do that? How do we get that message out? Several people have asked about the grass-fed versus grain-finished or whatever the description is. So I just wanted to show a little bit about some other meat issues. Because like I said, the sustainability thing gets conflated with many other issues, and we've got to tease them apart, but we can do that. So There's a couple things here. One, this is data from Susan Duckett's laboratory at Clemson University. Some of you may be familiar with her. On this end, closest to me, on this side and furthest away on that one, those two samples were from animals from their research. Okay? And you can see that they produced finished grain-fed beef with an omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acid ratio of less than 5. Now, this 4-to-1 target line that cuts across the screen, I would urge you to treat this with a block of salt. This is the product of that same Harvard School of Public Medicine that has so much else to answer for in the long term. But let's just take it for what it's worth and say, okay, that is in fact the target. How important is that difference of 0.84 in the ratio? No one knows. But then, yes, if you go buy a ribeye from the store and then everything after that is from the store, the poultry and the pork is from the store, and then Adele added the red bar for soybean oil. If somebody's going to tell me that they have to have grass-fed beef so they can have a ratio down in this range, and by the way, those ratios vary tremendously. I've got slides that could show a dozen studies where they are all over the board for grass-fed meat. But if that's the target, that's fine, but don't eat chicken or don't eat pork. Because those ratios are far worse. And they're always going to be worse. I don't care if they're pastured poultry or pastured pork, because the difference between a monogastric or a poultry digestive system and a ruminant digestive system is going to say they're always going to have a higher level of omega-6 in the fat. Now, I'm not saying not to eat poultry, and I'm surely not saying don't eat pork. But just if you're going to be so committed to grass-fed beef because of this factor, then consistency would demand that you don't eat the poultry or the pork. And the problem with just focusing on the ratios is then that ignores the whole question of how much you're actually ingesting of these substances that haven't been a big part of our diet for very long. So remember back here, the soybean oil was only 7.78 to 1. But when you look at how much you're actually getting, you're getting this whopping amount in a 2 tablespoon serving. That's easy application of salad dressing. I wouldn't put it past them, though, to start promoting how good a source of omega-3 they are, though. Look at how much you're getting from beef regardless of how it's produced. Beef, regardless of how it's finished, is not a rich source of either omega-6 or omega-3. I would like us to not get over our skis. I would like us to not get ahead of the data. I would like us to not be making claims about our product for 2 reasons. 1, it divides our industry and we can't afford it. Number 2, somebody knows this and they're waiting to play the card on us and say, well, you're wrong about this, so everything else you're saying, right? So let's not play that game. We don't have to. We really don't. I'm not denying that there are differences. I just showed you that there are differences, grass-fed to grain-finished. But the question then becomes the next step of the process is how important is that for human health? And you start looking at this data. This is saying how many ounces of cooked ground beef would it take to supply the omega-3 that you could get from 1 ounce of cooked wild-caught salmon? And you can look it up. Conventional ground beef, you'd have to eat 145 ounces. Bon appetit. You'd only have to eat 48 ounces of the grass-fed ground beef to equal what you could get from 1 ounce of salmon. So again, there's no there. The real insult is don't be concerned about that if you're still eating your vegetable oils. This is a little different because what I'm now saying is how many ounces of cooked wild-caught salmon would it take to balance out the omega-6 that's provided by 2 ounces, 1 serving, of these various vegetable oils? If you start at the top, you'd have to eat 32 ounces of salmon to counteract the omega-6 that you get from 2 ounces of safflower oil. And if you're going to try to do that with grass-fed beef, you'd have to multiply that 32 by 48. And oh, by the way, you can't do it because it's always going to have more omega-6. Vegetable oils are the insult. Don't get distracted. Don't let you get your eye off the prize here. People are worried about hormones in beef. This is some data that you can easily find. The difference between implanted and non-implanted beef is minuscule when you compare it to what a human being produces at various stages of its life. And if you then start looking at the fact that there are hormones in plants that produce estrogenic effects in human beings, and you start saying how many ounces of beef from an implanted animal would I have to eat to get the estrogen that's provided from these foods, you're going to come up with some silly numbers. And I checked them 3 times. I think the math is right. You're going to have to eat 53 ounces of beef from an implanted animal to equal the amount of estrogen you can get from from 3 ounces of butter, or 3 ounces of eggs, or I mean, this is where it gets silly, right? But this is reality. So people are looking for hormone-free beef, right? Which is a biological impossibility. Another reason not to eat white bread. And if you're eating soy in any form, just don't talk to me. Just don't start the conversation. It's ridiculous. Okay, there are other issues. Nitrate was an issue. It has been dispelled. E. coli, people for a while tried to say if it was grass-finished, you wouldn't, or grass-fed, you wouldn't get E. coli. That's a lie. It's a dangerous lie. They said it generated in feedlots. That's a lie. It's a scandalous lie. There's the whole thing about CLA, conjugated linoleic acid. If you heard the morning presentation, I gave you more biologically plausible reasons or avenues for dealing with cancer. CLA, there's been a couple very questionable studies, very high rates in rodents. Rodents are not furry little human beings. They respond differently. We have actual data with actual humans that's far more meaningful. CLA is probably not going to pan out, but it makes a great marketing claim. The issue of residues, pesticide and antibiotic have been, I'm trusting the surveillance system. So we'll leave it there. There's been some interesting stories. If somebody's interested, I'll talk about that. Antibiotic resistance is an interesting one because the best data is the problem is with human use, not agricultural use in animal science. And there was just a story recently about the first new antibiotic being released in about 20-some years and the promise that that offers of new antibiotics coming along. The man who used to be the state veterinarian in Oregon was a colleague of mine at Oregon State, and he said when he went through vet school in the 60s, everybody was talking about the coming problem of antibiotic resistance. And it's still coming, right? There are areas where it's a problem, there are hospitals, right? There are things like that. So I think that those are all areas, and every one of those you can find information on the line from industry. Places like the Meat Myth Crushers and the American Meat Institute and some other organizations have compiled this information, and it's available. And if you need help finding that, I'm happy to do that too. So at that point, I think I'm done. And thank you for your attention. And I hope I've made the case that ruminant agriculture, in fact, is sustainable and therefore can be green. Thank you.
All right.